The river thundered like a living beast, swollen with storm water, its brown waves snapping branches and swallowing whole logs in its rage. Elias Carter stood frozen for a heartbeat on the muddy bank, rain dripping from the brim of his battered hat, before the sound that cut him to bone pierced through the roar. A child scream. He saw them. Two small figures flailing in the torrent, one boy's arm reaching desperately toward nothing, the little girl already vanishing under the foam. He didn't think. He jumped. The shock of the water stole his breath, icy needles stabbing his chest as the current hurled him downstream. He fought for air, choking on silt and spray, eyes stinging, boots dragging against rocks. Ahead, the boy's head bobbed once, twice, then went under. Elias clawed through the torrent, lungs burning, caught the boy's shirt, and yanked him up. The girl spun past, limp as a rag, hair plastered to her pale face. He kicked, pushed, cursed through clenched teeth, forcing his aching arms to hold both children against him as the current fought to tear them away. For an instant, he almost let go. His body screamed to surrender, to stop fighting a river that could swallow cattle whole. But something inside him, something stubborn, raw, and unwilling, tightened its grip. He would not watch another life slip through his hands. Not again. The boy gasped and coughed in his arm, but the girl was still, head lolled back. Elias dragged them sideways to a break in the bank, every muscle on fire, every kick slower than the last. When his boots found purchase, he hauled the children onto a tangle of roots, then collapsed beside them, chest heaving, vision spinning with black spots. He slapped the girl's back, rolled her gently, prayed against reason. A trickle of water spilled from her lips. She coughed weakly, but it was enough. Elias lay in the mud with them, gasping like a drowning man who had finally remembered to breathe. Rain pattered softer now, tapping on the leaves, as if the storm had spent itself with the night. He looked at their faces, brown-skinned, dark-haired, unmistakably Apache. Trouble. He pulled them close anyway, wrapped his coat around their shivering bodies, and muttered with grim humor, "Well, Elias, you've done it now. Reckon you'll be scalped before breakfast." His voice rasped dry, but the words steadied him. By the time he staggered to his cabin, the sky was bleeding gray over the mountains. The fire took too long to light. His hands shook from cold, and his bones groaned with every movement. But finally the flames caught. He laid the boy and girl on a bed of quilts, stripped their soaked clothes, wrapped them in blankets, and rubbed warmth back into their stiff arms. The boy opened his eyes once, mumbled something in his language, then fell back into sleep. Elias sat back on his haunches, staring at them as the fire crackled. He should have left them. The thought crept in like a snake. They were not his problem, not his blood. Their kin would come looking, and when they did, they would see a lone rancher in a broken-down shack with two of their children under his roof. No explanation would save him. He knew what it meant, but his heart argued louder than his reason. He remembered his wife's face, pale with fever, her hands slipping from his as he begged her to hold on. He hadn't saved her. He hadn't saved the child they lost before birth. His whole life was failure stacked on failure, debts piling like stones on his back. Yet tonight, in the river, he had pulled two lives from death's grasp. Maybe that mattered more than anything else. He leaned back in his chair, weary beyond measure, listening to the children's breathing settle into a rhythm. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the air sharp and clean, the silence unnerving in its stillness. Elias closed his eyes, just for a moment, letting the heat of fire soak into his battered frame. Dawn came cruel and sudden. The first light sliced across the valley, spilling gold over the wet grass and casting long shadows across the hills. Dust rose in the distance. Elias blinked, rubbed his eyes, thought at first it was morning mist. But mist didn't move in a straight line. Mist didn't gleam with sunlight off spear points and rifle barrels. He stepped onto his porch, heart thudding like a war drum. The horizon rippled with horses, riders spreading across the plain, their silhouettes sharp and unyielding against the light. 100 of them, maybe more. At their head, a towering figure rode, feathers trailing in the wind, eyes burning with fire Elias could feel even from afar. The rancher's throat went dry. He didn't need to count them to know what they were. Fathers came when children went missing. Warriors came when blood was owed. Elias tightened his jaw, looked back in the cabin where the children still slept, then out again at the advancing riders. His voice came low, almost a growl, but steady. They weren't here to thank me. The ground trembled beneath the weight of hooves, the sound rolling like thunder across a valley. Elias stood on the porch, every instinct telling him to run. But there was nowhere to go. Dusty stamped nervously in the corral, ears pinned back, as though he too understood what approached. Elias kept his eyes fixed on the riders. He knew fear was pointless. The only thing left was to face it. The line of horsemen slowed as they neared the cabin, fanning out in a crescent. Spears glinted in the morning light. Rifles rested across saddles, and faces hardened by years of struggle studied him with suspicion. At their center rode a man who dwarfed the rest, broad-shouldered and tall, scars cutting across his weathered skin like old maps of battle survived. His gaze was sharp, unblinking, as though he could strip Elias's soul bare with a glance. The chief dismounted with deliberate calm, dust settling around his boots. The silence was unbearable, the kind that made the air thick, the kind that spoke louder than words. Elias wanted to explain, to speak first, but his throat caught. It was the boy's weak voice from inside the cabin that broke the stillness. "Father." The warriors stirred. The children, wrapped in blankets, had woken and stood in the doorway, faces pale but alive. Relief flickered across the chief's features, but suspicion quickly smothered it. He looked at Elias with the weight of judgment, eyes narrowing. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, carrying authority that silenced even the restless horses. "You have my children. Why?" The question sliced clean through the air. Elias swallowed, forcing his voice not to tremble. "They were drowning. I pulled them out. That's all there is to it." The warriors muttered in their own tongue, some voices sharp, others doubtful. Several leaned forward on their saddles, hands itching toward weapons. One spat in the dirt. Elias didn't move, didn't raise his hands, didn't beg. He simply stood, jaw set, meeting the chief's stare. The girl spoke next, her small hand clutching the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "He saved us. The river took us. He brought us back." Her words were thin, but clear. A silence followed, longer and heavier than the last. Elias could feel the tension like a drawn bowstring, waiting to snap. He wanted to believe her voice was enough, but the sight of rifles shifting, spears lowering, told him it wasn't. These men had lost too much to trust easily. He felt his chest tighten, memories rising unbidden. The night his wife's fever raged, and he sat powerless, wishing for some stranger to appear with a cure he couldn't find. The child they buried without a name. His own failures stacked like stones on his shoulders. He couldn't undo any of it, but he could stand here now, in this moment, and not flinch. His voice came rough but firm. "I couldn't save my own family, but I saved yours. If you'll kill me for it, then get on with it." He paused, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "But at least wait till after breakfast." "I skipped mine." A ripple went through the warriors. Some scowled at his audacity. Others smirked despite themselves. The chief did not smile, but a faint glimmer shifted in his eyes, something between surprise and consideration. He stepped closer, boots crunching the wet earth, and stopped just a breath away from Elias. The air seemed to grow heavier, the morning light sharper. Elias could smell leather, horse sweat, and smoke clinging to the chief's skin. "You speak of honor," the chief said, "but words are wind. Men show truth by their courage." Elias raised his chin. "Then tell me how to show it." The chief turned to his warriors, speaking in his tongue, voice strong and commanding. The men quieted. When he faced Elias again, his decision was clear. "You will ride with us. Alone. If you are a liar, you die among us. If you are true, you live." The weight of it settled like a stone in Elias's gut. Ride with him into the wilderness, surrounded by men who already saw him as an enemy. He thought of the townsfolk, how they'd whisper his foolishness, how they'd say he dug his own grave. But he also thought of the children, their fragile breaths steady inside his cabin, alive because of his choice. He nodded once, no hesitation. "Then I ride." The warriors stirred, murmuring, some clearly dissatisfied, but none challenged the chief. Elias saddled Dusty with careful hands, feeling the horse's unease but steadying him with soft words. When he mounted, he caught the eyes of the townsfolk gathered on the ridge. Their faces were pale, whispers carrying even across the distance. "He's done for. Dead man riding." The war party moved out, dust curling behind them, the cabin shrinking against the horizon. Elias rode in the center, every side hemmed by riders whose eyes never left him. The silence pressed in, broken only by hoofbeats and the occasional creak of leather. As the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the plain, they reached a camp nestled among cottonwoods. Fires were lit, meat roasted, children laughed in the distance. Elias dismounted when told, the warriors' glares following him as though waiting for the slightest misstep. He kept his hands loose at his sides, careful not to appear afraid, though every nerve screamed at him. Later, by the fire, he sat apart, the chief across from him, face unreadable in the flicker of flame. The rescued children had run into their mother's arms, safe and warm, while Elias sat with nothing but the ache in his bones and the weight of suspicion pressing on him. Then he noticed it. Shadows moving beyond the circle of firelight. Too many, too deliberate. Not warriors, not Apaches. Shapes crouched low, rifles glinting in the dark. Many recognized. The bounty hunters who haunted saloons and alleyways, greedy for coin, reckless with blood. They were moving into position, circling, preparing to strike. Elias's breath caught, his hand instinctively tightening around the tin cup in his grip. If the camp was attacked, the Apaches would blame him. To them, it would look like betrayal, a trick, a trap. His life balanced on a knife's edge sharper than any blade. He stared into the fire, forcing his face calm even as his heart thundered louder than the river had hours before. Trouble wasn't behind him anymore. It was here, in the night, closing in. Gunfire shattered the night. The first crack split the silence, followed by a storm of bullets whining through the cottonwoods. Horses reared and screamed. Warriors shouted. Flames whipped in the sudden chaos. Elias dove sideways as a ball tore into the log where his head had been a heartbeat before. Smoke burned his throat, the stench of powder mixing with roasted meat thrown from a fire. He hit the dirt, rolled, and came up behind a log, heart hammering against his ribs. The bounty hunters had swarmed from the dark, rifles blazing, faces twisted in greed. They weren't here for the Apaches. They were here for him. And whatever blood money the town had put on his head. Arrows hissed back in answer, warriors unleashing cries that split the night. The camp erupted into a battlefield, firelight turning every figure into a jerking shadow. Elias's hand found a rifle knocked from a fallen warrior. He hesitated only a moment before yanking it close. His palms were slick with sweat and blood, but his aim was steady. He squeezed the trigger, the recoil rattling his bones, and a bounty hunter went down in the brush. The choice was clear. Stand with these people, or be swallowed by men who'd hang him anyway. He shifted, fired again, the sharp cracks echoing through the trees. A bullet clipped his shoulder, fire searing into his flesh, but he bit down on the cry and stayed on his feet. He wasn't fighting for the Apaches, not at first. He was fighting for those two children asleep in their mother's arms, the ones he had dragged from death's grip, and maybe, just maybe, for the hollow piece of himself that longed for redemption. Chief Nakona appeared at his side, rifle flashing in the firelight, his scarred face lit like a carving of stone. They stood back to back, shifting with the rhythm of survival, neither speaking but both moving as though they had fought together 100 times. Elias caught himself almost laughing in the madness. "Guess I just bought myself 100 new in-laws," he muttered under his breath, though the words were lost in the roar of battle. The fight raged long into the night. Hunters fell. Apaches pressed them. The ground littered with shells and arrows. But greed made men stubborn. The bounty hunters pushed harder, circling, hoping to break through. In the smoke, Elias spotted a familiar shape, a tall man with a bowler hat tipped low, rifle gleaming in his grip. McGraw, the banker who had circled Elias like a vulture ever since debt had gutted his ranch. It clicked like thunder. McGraw had sent these men, not for the Apaches, not even for the money. He wanted Elias dead, gone, and his land seized clean of its stubborn owner. Rage boiled through the pain in Elias's shoulder. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the raw fury of a man cornered one too many times. He tried to line up a shot, but McGraw melted into the trees, letting his hired guns bleed for his schemes. Elias cursed, teeth grinding, knowing this wasn't over. Not tonight, but someday soon, their reckoning would come. The tide turned when the hunters realized their advantage had slipped. Too many of them had fallen. Too many horses spooked and scattered. The Apaches pressed forward with unity born from survival, cries echoing, firelight painting their faces fierce and unyielding. One by one, the hunters broke and fled into the darkness, rifles snapping desperate cover fire as they vanished into the night. The silence afterward rang louder than the battle. Smoke curled into the stars, mingling with the smell of blood and burned wood. Elias dropped the empty rifle, his chest heaving, body trembling with exhaustion. He looked down and realized his shirt was soaked, the wound in his shoulder pulsing hot and wet. His knees buckled, and for a moment he thought he'd fall into the dirt. A hand steadied him, strong, calloused, unshaking. Nakona stood over him, face unreadable, though his eyes spoke volumes. Elias met his gaze, searching for judgment, suspicion, anything that might condemn him. But the chief's hand stayed firm on his chest, pressing against the wound, grounding him. "You fought with us," Nakona said, his voice deep as the earth. "Not against us." Elias tried to laugh, but it came out as a rasp. Didn't see much of a choice. "They were aiming to kill me too." The chief's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but not far from it. "Still, a man chooses where he stands. Tonight you stood true." Elias's vision blurred, stars and firelight mixing in dizzy swirls. He wanted to say more, to explain that he hadn't fought out of nobility. Not really. He had fought because his conscience wouldn't let him do anything else, because he was tired of losing everyone who mattered. But the words wouldn't come. His strength ebbed like water draining from a cracked bucket. The children appeared then, darting from their mother's arms despite her protests. They knelt by him, eyes wide, small hands clutching his own as though their touch could keep him tethered to life. Elias forced a smile, even through the pain. "Told you I'd keep you safe," he whispered, though the words barely carried. Nakona looked at his warriors, then back to Elias. His hand pressed firmly on the rancher's chest, not to pin him, but to claim him. His voice carried the weight of something final. "You are one of us now." The world tilted, darkness closing in, but Elias felt something stir inside before it swallowed him whole. For the first time in years, maybe for the first time since his wife's laughter had filled his cabin, he felt he belonged somewhere. The thought clung to him as his body gave way, as he slipped into unconsciousness with the fire's crackle fading into silence. And even in that silence, he knew the fight wasn't over. Somewhere out there, McGraw still breathed. Somewhere out there, the past he thought buried was waiting for him. Elias woke to the smell of sage and smoke, his shoulder bound in clean hides, his body heavy as stone. The world came back slowly. The crackle of fire, the murmurs of voices, the laughter of children somewhere nearby. He was not in his cabin, nor in any place he had known. The Apache camp stretched around him, lean-tos of hide and brush, fires smoldering, horses grazing near the trees. For a moment he thought he must be dreaming. Then the pain in his shoulder reminded him it was no dream. Days passed in the blur of recovery. The women tended his wound with herbs that stung but healed. The men watched him with wary eyes, and the children peeked at him from behind poles and laughed when he pretended to scowl. Elias learned to move again, slowly at first, then with more strength. Each dawn, Chief Nakona came to sit beside him, speaking little, but his presence was steady, unshakable as the mountains themselves. Elias, once a stranger in his own land, began to feel the edges of belonging. When he was strong enough to walk, Nakona took him into the hills. They hunted together, moving silent as shadows, the chief showing him how to read tracks, how to notice what most men ignored. The snap of a twig, the tilt of a bird's head. Elias listened, humbled, for the first time in years open to learning something new. With each lesson, He felt the weight of his failures shift, not gone, but carried differently. He laughed again, awkward at first, then easier when the children teased him and the warriors no longer looked at him like an intruder. But peace is never a gift that lasts long in a land like this. Word came by a trader that the town had branded him a traitor. McGraw's lies had spread like wildfire. Elias had joined the Apache, turned against his own, and killed white men in cold blood. His ranch was already being divided, his debts settled in McGraw's favor. The banker had won without firing a shot. Elias sat by the fire that night, fury simmering low in his chest. He had saved lives, bled for them, stood in the line of fire, and yet he was marked as less than nothing. Nakona saw the store in his face and spoke quietly, almost like a friend. A man cannot run forever. If a snake coils at your door, you must strike it, or it will strike you. Elias nodded. He knew it was true. He could not stay hidden in the camp forever, not while McGraw's shadow stretched over everything he had left. The land, though broken and barren, was his. More than that, his name, whatever it was worth, was still his. If he let McGraw steal that too, then all his fighting had been for nothing. The morning he rode back. The air was sharp and clear, the kind of air that made every sound carry. He did not ride alone. Nakona and a dozen warriors flanked him, silent but resolute. The sight of them together turned heads long before they reached the town's edge. Mothers pulled children indoors. Shutters banged shut. Men gathered rifles nervously. By the time Elias reined Dusty onto the main street, the whole town seemed to be holding its breath. McGraw was waiting, smug and clean as ever, his bowler hat tipped low, his hands resting easy on the rifle slung across his arm. Behind him stood hired gunmen, half a dozen, their faces mean, their fingers twitching for the draw. He looked at Elias as though the man were already a corpse. "You got a lot of nerve, show your face here," McGraw called, his voice smooth, practiced for crowds. "You can sort with savages, kill decent men, then crawl back thinking you can take what ain't yours." Elias's voice was rough, but carried strong. "That land was mine before you set foot on it. My blood's in that soil. My wife is buried there. You want it, McGraw. You'll have to take it from me yourself." The street held still, the air electric with waiting. Rain clouds gathered overhead, the kind that turned dust into mud and thunder into judgment. McGraw sneered, motioned to his men. "Then let's settle it." The draw came sudden and sharp. Gunfire cracked, horses screamed, men dove for cover. Elias moved on instinct, Dusty rearing his bullets toward the air. He fired once, twice, each shot echoing through his bones. Gunmen fell, shouting curses, their rifles clattering against the mud. Nakona's warriors moved like a storm, arrows and bullets answering every attack. Lightning split the sky. Thunder rolled, and in the chaos, Elias found McGraw across the street, steady as a rattler, rifle raised. Their eyes met, old hatred burning like oil on water. McGraw fired first. The ball grazed Elias's side, hot and tearing, but he stayed upright. He leveled his revolver, breath steady, and squeezed the trigger. McGraw jerked, shock spreading across his face before he crumpled into the mud. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the hiss of rain beginning to fall. When it was over, the townsfolk crept from their hiding places, eyes wide, staring at Elias not as a ghost or traitor, but as a man who had stood his ground. The warriors melted back, leaving Elias in the center of the street, rain washing the blood from his hands, the mud sucking at his boots. Nakona stepped forward, placed a hand on his shoulder, and gave a single nod. It was enough. The days that followed were quiet, almost unnervingly so. Elias reclaimed his land, battered as it was, and with the help of the Apache began to rebuild. Posts were reset, roofs patched, fields seeded. The children he had once pulled from the river came often, laughing in the fields, chasing Dusty until the old horse snorted with indignation. For the first time in years, the ranch did not feel like a graveyard. It felt like the beginning of something new. At dusk, when the sky burned red and the cicadas sang, Elias would sit on his porch and let the peace wash over him. He thought often of his wife, of the child he never held, of the man he had been, broken, bitter, hollow. That man was gone now. In his place stood someone scarred, someone weary, but someone who had chosen to fight and keep standing no matter how the river pulled. One evening, with the fireflies rising and the children's laughter still echoing, Elias looked out over his land and spoke softly, almost as though telling the earth itself. In saving them, I save myself. The narrator's voice carried over the fading light, rich and steady, inviting the listener not just to witness but to reflect. Out here, a man can lose everything to the dust, the river, or the barrel of a gun. But sometimes, in the fight to save another, he finds a part of himself he thought was gone. And that's a story worth remembering. Then, softer, with a note of invitation. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.